Of course, an alcoholic ought to be freed from his physical craving for liquor, and this often requires a definite hospital procedure before psychological measures can be of maximum benefit. It's hard for him, it's very hard for him to admit that what's going on here is utterly outside of the purview of his abilities or the facilities of this magnificent hospital. Psychological measures. But he's right that in many cases, and of course we all know this, in many cases it's very important to get detoxed in some medical way before we croak, because getting off the alcohol, a lot of us just don't make it. The first full paragraph, this is so important. This is the basis of everything. We believe, and so suggested a few years ago, that the action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy, that the phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. It's interesting when you stop to think about it. Many of you folks have had experience with drugs as well as with booze. The same apparently is not true of drugs, because it seems that anybody who abuses a narcotic drug is an addictive substance will become addicted. But alcoholics are a little different. There are lots and lots of people out there who drink very, very heavily, maybe as heavily as we did, but they can stop, or they can modify if they have sufficient reason to do so. They do not suffer from the phenomenon of craving. They do not have the allergy. Now this next sentence goes directly to our first step, and I'll show you how. These allergic types can never safely use alcohol in any form at all. And once having formed the habit and found they cannot break it, once having lost their will, having lost their self-confidence, their reliance upon things human, their problems pile up on them and become astonishingly difficult to solve. Now let's see how that fits. Turn to page 30 in this third chapter. The first page of the third chapter. And the first two paragraphs tell it all. Page 30. Most of us have been unwilling to admit we were real alcoholics. No person likes to think he is bodily and mentally different from his fellows. Oh, but we are. Therefore, it's not surprising that our drinking careers have been characterized by countless vain attempts to prove we could drink like other people. The idea that somehow, someday he will control and enjoy his drinking is the great obsession of every abnormal drinker. The persistence of this illusion is astonishing. This is a big part of the insanity, isn't it? Many pursue it into the gates of insanity or death. And then this next paragraph of 4 lines is the first step. This is the first step. We learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholics. This is the first step in recovery. Also, the delusion that we are like other people or presently may be has to be smashed. Now we can see the true outlines of the first step, can't we? It requires, through a learning process, that we reach a point through the grace of God as a great gift. We reach the point where we are able to fully concede to our innermost selves that we are alcoholic. But it requires more than that we have learned and we have accepted as an absolute fact, as Dr. Silkworth says right here, can never safely use alcohol in any form at all. The first full paragraph on page 24. The fact is that most alcoholics, for reasons yet obscure, have lost the power of choice in drink. That's what it means to be powerless. It means we cannot stop on our own. We cannot choose to not drink and have it stick. Our so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent. Then why do we insist on telling people, just don't drink? We are unable at certain times, listen to this now, here's another one of these myths that floats around here and given so much coinage I can't believe it. We are unable at certain times to bring into our consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago. Oh, but you got to keep it green. Well, how do I do that? Well, I don't know, but keep it green. If you can't remember your last drunk, you haven't had it. But I was in a blackout. It doesn't matter. Listen to this now. This is the rule. This is the basis of everything that's going on here. We are without defense against the first drink. And if we don't remember that, you know, we're going to get so far off base that we begin to think that we can do it ourselves and we don't need God. And that's deadly. Another paragraph here, this is so beautiful, I love this. Second paragraph in the doctor's opinion there on 28 or 26. Frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices. Oh, well, think of your children. Aren't you're just doing all these bad things? What's the matter? Haven't you got any willpower? It's just not nice to see you behaving that way toward your grandmother. Well, she's an old bat. Yes, but honey, remember she's rich. Oh my. Frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices. Now listen here. The message which can interest and hold these alcoholic people must have depth and weight. And believe me, that's what's in this book. Depth and weight. In nearly all cases, their ideals must be grounded in a power greater than themselves if they are to recreate their lives. Let's take a look at page 45 just for a second. We'll see how Bill picked up on this one. Page 45 in the 4th chapter. Lack of power, that was our dilemma. And of course this means we lack power over the alcohol. We lack power over the next drink. But it also means that we are powerless over our thinking. Our thinking processes are so badly warped out by fear that we're powerless now to do anything about it. And we'll see that later as we get toward the 4th and 5th steps. We had to find a power. Notice the word had to. That's kind of like must, isn't it? And must in this book and in this program means or else. We had to find a power by which we could live, and of course that's as opposed to die, isn't it? And it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously. Well, thank you, Bill, for that word. Not so damned obvious to everybody. It is, by the way, that's the second shortest sentence in the Big Book. There's one that's shorter. When we get there, I'll point out to you. A little bit of age trivia. But where and how are we to find this power? Now, here's what we were leading up to. Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself which will solve your problem. 2 lines down, it means, of course, that we're going to talk about God. Let's go back over here now, back in the doc's opinion again. Second full paragraph, Again, in nearly all cases, their ideals, that's the alcoholic's ideals, must be grounded in a power greater than themselves if they are to recreate their lives. Now this recreate is I'm not sure that's an appropriate word, because what's really happening with us is that we're not going back and reliving that thing we call the life before we got here. What's happening is we're getting a whole new life. That's why the Bigbook says that we were reborn, because we're going to have a total rebirth of thinking. Our whole attitude and outlook upon life will change. And the book also tells us that when the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. And that's all part of the rebirth. Now then, let's go on. If any feel that as psychiatrists directing a hospital for alcoholics we appear somewhat sentimental, let them stand with us a while on the firing line. Oh, that's good. That's where Bill got this firing line stuff. And you get back into chapter 7. What he said, what he wrote there was, let's see, what did he say? Stay on the firing line of life, and God will protect you. Stay on the firing line of life with these motives, and God will protect you. See the tragedies, the despairing wives, the little children. Let the solving of these problems become a part of their daily work, and even of their sleeping moments. And the most cynical will not wonder that we have accepted and encouraged this movement. We feel, after many years of experience, that we have found nothing which has contributed more to the rehabilitation of these men than the altruistic movement now growing up among them. Amen to that, brother. And you know, yeah, and hallelujah too, sister. Men and women drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol. Well, now, what in the world is that effect? Let's stop and think about it for a second. If you go back to the time when you, or just before and just after you picked up the first drink, if you can remember that, for almost all of us, our lives were characterized by tremendous fear and anxiety. And we were afraid of all kinds of things. And that fear is very painful. Fear is very painful. And it's very toxic. And it's very communicable. And they tell us, and I don't know whether it's true or not, but my own experience, I would be willing to agree with it, that the most exquisite feeling in the world is the release from pain. We picked up that first drink and we drank it, and guess what? No more fear. No more fear. My God, we felt like we could dance all night and everybody would applaud. Every desirable person in that room would want to dance with us and go out with us. And we were funny and articulate and smart and handsome and beautiful. And nothing had changed except that we had a little booze in us. And what had happened there, the booze took away the fear that we were not handsome, we were not beautiful, we were not funny, we were not wise, we were not desirable, we couldn't dance worth a damn. And we were over there plastered on the wall exactly where we belonged. And the fear said, no, that's not, none of that's true. You're really just absolutely marvelous, scintillating, wonderful person. And that fear went away and we said, wow, what in the world is this stuff? I never felt like this before. Give me more. So many of us, got dead drunk that first night or first day. Some of us even had blackouts that first time. Did we learn anything from that? No. Well, what we learned was, man, I wanted that feeling again. Give me 5 hours to recover and I'm right back out there doing it again. The sensation is so elusive that while they admit it is injurious, they cannot, after a time, differentiate the true from the false. That's just pure insanity, isn't it? See what's happened to our brains? I mean, they've really been warped. To them, their alcoholic life seems the only normal one. I'll bet you everybody in this room can agree with that. I mean, after all, who doesn't drink? All the people I know drink. And all the people down there at the bar, they're my good friends down there. They all drink like I do. Well, I might drink a little bit more, but then I hold it better. And that's why they always ask me to drive. And they're very wise about that, because after I've had a few drinks, I'm a terrific driver. They are restless, irritable, and discontented unless they can again experience the sense of ease and comfort which comes at once by taking a few drinks which they see others taking with impunity. I want you to notice where Dr. Silkworth says this and what he's talking about. Restless, irritable, and discontented is not something he's using to describe the alcoholic in recovery. He's not saying that this is the trigger, so-called trigger, that the treatment centers love to talk about for drinking. He's talking about the people who are drinking. And once they have come down, now they get restless, irritable, and discontent till they can again grab some more booze and get the feeling back. Being restless, irritable, and discontented is not the reason we drink. We drink because we cannot help ourselves. Because we are powerless over alcohol. Because we are alcoholics. We don't need any excuse to drink. Somebody who is happy as a clam at high tide will say, boy, a drink would go good right now, and without any further thought, pick up a drink, another drink, and a few more drinks after that. You say, well, wonder why she did that. She was just as happy as she could be. After they have succumbed to the desire again, as so many do, and the phenomena of craving develops, they pass through the well-known stages of a spree, emerging remorseful, with a firm resolution not to drink again. This is repeated over and over, and unless this person can experience, listen to this now, an entire psychic change, there is very little hope of his recovery. And he goes on to say this, on the other hand, as strange as it may seem to those who do not understand, once the psychic change has occurred, the very same person who seemed doomed, who had so many problems he despaired of ever solving them, suddenly finds himself easily able to control his desire for alcohol. The only effort necessary, listen to this now, being that required to follow a few simple rules. Where in the world does that say anything about suggestions? You jump out of an airplane, the rule is you pull the ripcord. A few simple rules. Men have cried out to me in sincere and despairing appeal, Doctor, I cannot go on like this. I have everything to live for. I must stop, but I cannot. You must help me. Faced with this problem, if a doctor is honest with himself, he must sometimes feel his own inadequacy. Although he gives all that is in him, it often is not enough. One feels that something more than human power is needed to produce the essential psychic change. More than human power. See, Dr. Silkworth, by the time he wrote this in 1939, had been watching AA at work in his hospital for over 3 years. So he knew what was going on. he saw that these psychic changes were taking place, and he saw that they were not coming as a result of his ministrations or his people, his staff. They were coming about because of what the AA people were bringing to his patients. One feels that something more than human power is needed to produce the essential psychic change. Though the aggregate of recoveries resulting from psychiatric effort is considerable, we physicians must admit we have made little impression upon the problem as a whole. Many types do not respond to the ordinary psychological approach. I do not hold with those who believe that alcoholism is entirely a problem of mental control. I have had many men who had, for example, worked a period of months on some problem or business deal which was to be settled on a certain date favorably to them. They took a drink a day or so prior to the date, and then the phenomenon of craving at once became paramount to all other interests, so that the important appointment was not met. These men were not drinking to escape. Listen to this now. These men were not drinking to escape. They were drinking to overcome a craving beyond their mental control. Now, all of this stuff, as you can see, is very, very essential to the first step. Anybody who's brand new, who hasn't read this and isn't reading it, if you're sponsoring, go through these things with them carefully, because this stuff is absolute dynamite. This is what breaks down the denial. This is what brings some understanding to the new person, that they're not dealing here with badness or lack of willpower, they're dealing with a disease. He goes on to say there are many situations which arise out of the phenomenon of craving which cause men to make the supreme sacrifice rather than continue to fight. I mean, this is pretty serious stuff. The supreme sacrifice he's talking about is drinking themselves to death. They would rather die than quit. And I'm sure there are people in here who have experienced something similar to that. I was talking to a guy yesterday who said that he was threatened with life imprisonment. And he was so sick, sore, and wounded from alcohol that he was looking forward to it. He would have a place to sleep, 3 meals a day, and no responsibilities. In other words, he would be escaping from life into a jail cell, and that he was so far down that at that point that looked real good to him. I don't know if anybody in here has ever been that low, but I suspect some of you have been. And if you have, you know exactly what we're talking about. But rather make the supreme sacrifice than to continue to fight. The classification of alcoholics seems most difficult and in much detail is outside the scope of this book. There are, of course, the psychopaths who are emotionally unstable. We're all familiar with this type. They're always going on the wagon for keeps. They are over-remorseful and make many resolutions, but never a decision. There is the type of man who is unwilling to admit that he cannot take a drink. He plans various ways of drinking. He changes his brand or his environment. There is the type who always believes that after being entirely free from alcohol for a period of time, he can take a drink without danger. Now that's pretty common, you know. We get a lot of folks coming in here who really are carrying that idea in the back of their minds. And as we said before, they're not going to be able to take a proper first step because they're doing it with reservations. There is the manic depressive type who is perhaps the least understood by his friends and about whom a whole chapter could be written. Today we have a different word for that, a different phrase, I forget what it is. Bipolar. Yeah, bipolar. And you know, obviously, as you look at me, I don't have a medical degree. I've never practiced medicine, nor do I intend to even try. But there are some things I know from having been around here a long time. One of those is that in most of the treatment centers today, they are specializing in bipolar. And the reason they are, from what I can understand, is that they cannot be paid for alcoholic recovery. There has to be some kind of a disease syndrome to be paid. And of course, if that's so, then the easy thing to do with any alcoholic is call them bipolar and start to medicate them. I think it's important for you, if you're new, to take a hard look at this possibility that you are going on the assumption that you have some kind of a dread bipolar disease, when in fact the real problem is that you're an alcoholic and that you're full of fear, because fear is that force which stands behind depression, stands behind it solidly. So there's a danger there that we will believe that somehow or another we can't survive without this medicine that they give us, when in fact the only thing we really need is to get right with God. Now, of course, it's not up to me or anybody else who's your sponsor or working with you to tell you that whatever you got to do one way or another. That's entirely up to you. You see, there's another fact of life here which we seldom hear about, but it's the truth. Our recovery, each of us individually, our recovery is our own personal obligation. We are responsible for our own recovery. We can't lay it off on anybody else. So it's necessary for us to take a look at these things and to decide for ourselves what we think we ought to do. And if we need some help or advice from people who've been there before, for goodness sakes, we get it. But it's talking about writing a whole chapter on a manic depressive. Now, manic depressive in those days was an identifiable disease, which was the symptoms of which were extreme agitation and mania on the one end of the scale, followed by a deep depression on the other side. And this cycle apparently is normal with all people, but in the psychopathic manic depressive, it's exaggerated, so that in the mania phase they're very dangerous. In the depression stage, they're dangerous to themselves and dangerous. They could very easily lapse into some kind of a depression from which they would not recover. That's what it used to be. I don't know. This bipolar stuff seems way too facile for me. But anyway, there's something to think about and something to consult with. You might want to consult with a family doctor. You might want to consult with somebody who's been there before you, who's already been through this, and see what their experience was. Going on, then there are types entirely normal in every respect, except in the effect alcohol has upon them. They are often able, intelligent, friendly people. And you know, there are a lot of us around like that. A lot of you folks would fit that category precisely. There isn't, you know, you dig around back there and you can't find all that much mess in your life. You did a lot of stuff really well, but somehow or another, alcohol has you by the throat. One of the things I've known and learned in here is that alcoholics, by and large, are pretty smart. There's a high degree of intelligence and a great deal of intuitive ability with alcoholics. I don't know whether that's necessary, but it seems to be typical. And so sometimes I think we're way too smart for our own good, and we like to try to figure things out rather than follow directions. And sometimes we're better off just following directions and doing what the people before us did. They recovered, now we can recover. And by the way, there is a complete description of these various types of alcoholics and the progression of the disease in the chapter to wives, beginning on page 108. Okay, all these and many others have one symptom in common. Listen to this, they cannot start drinking without developing the phenomenon of craving. This phenomenon, as we have suggested, may be the manifestation of an allergy which differentiates these people and sets them apart as a distinct entity. It has never been, by any treatment with which we are familiar, permanently eradicated. The only relief we have to suggest is entire abstinence. Can you see the doctor just putting his hands up and saying, I surrender? We've tried everything we know. We've tried hot baths and cold baths. We've tried belladonna poisoning. We've tried conditioning and Pavlovian theory. We've tried psychiatry. We've tried group therapy. We've tried encounter groups. We've tried all this stuff. We've tried psychometrics. We've even called in the acupuncturist and the hypnotist. And once in a while a psychic to try to find some way to help these people, but nothing works. And we give up. What's he say again? The only relief we have to suggest is entire abstinence. Now this business of abstinence, you know, is pretty unusual actually. We think of it as being common because we're in AA. But for most people, the idea of having to be totally abstinent just doesn't occur to them. What they're really thinking is, well, you just ought to cut back. I mean, lots of people drink here and there. They have a drink and might leave half one on the table. They get a little tiny buzz and they feel good, and they get a little bit garrulous and they tell funny jokes and stuff. We ought to be able to do that too. Why do we overdrink? That was what my one and only wife, thank you God, used to always say that to me. James, why do you overdrink? Well, she sipped on her Manischewitz wine and left half of it in the glass. She used to tell me I was crazy, but she's the one who ended up in the nut house. So who was the crazy one in my family? I don't know. So the view, you see, that people have is not one of abstinence. Now here's a kind of interesting historical fact. There used to be a movement in the United States back in the 1800s called the temperance movement. And the temperance movement was really a creature of the churches, and they wanted people to slow down. Temperance meant just don't drink so much, just don't get drunk. Never occurred to them that these people who were afflicted, these town drunks, had to quit altogether. Somehow or another, it seemed that they should be able to drink just a little bit here and there and kind of enjoy it. And you know, it's a funny thing. You go into many churches today where they're trying to help the alcoholics and addicts in their congregation. They got the same idea. Just cut back. Just don't use so much. Just don't drink quite so much. Well, you can do it. You know, you've got God, you've got whatever. Just ask for help. Just ask for help. I heard a sermon one time. Said, held up a glass of water and said, now, this is the drink you take. And he had his pitcher here. Poured another one. This is the drink you don't take. Hey, you wait a while. This is the drink you take. This is the drink you don't take. See how that works? That way you don't get drunk, you have a good time. That makes good sense, doesn't it? And all the congregants go, oh yeah, sure, preacher, that's right. These people didn't have the foggiest idea what goes on with us, did they? Can you imagine? you imagine an alcoholic, he's sitting there, or he or she's sitting there with a jug of martinis. Pour a martini, drink that, pour another one, pour it back in. No, we're not about to do that. Even if we run out of olives, we won't do that. Oh well. So what Dr. Silkworth is saying, what we know to be obvious, but it isn't obvious to the rest of the world. The only answer is abstinence, total abstinence. The plugs in the jug, we're through drinking forever. And so, if it makes you mad, that we took away your bottle? Hoo-ha. Tough. That's the way it is. No more booze. Okay, open your books up please to page 28, XXVII or XXXX. Bottom of the page. We've just discovered that Dr. Silkworth has concluded that the only relief that's possible for a chronic alcoholic is complete abstinence. Going on, he says this immediately precipitates us into a seething cauldron of debate. Much has been written pro and con, but among physicians, the general opinion seems to be that most chronic alcoholics are doomed. Wow. An incurable, progressive, deadly disease. The only incurable deadly disease in the world that I know of which denies its own existence, hides from us, hides the facts from us, teaches us to deny and to rationalize and to become self-deluded about it, about the very existence of the disease itself. Top of the page. What is the solution? Perhaps I can best answer this by reading, because remember we've got a whole chapter called There Is a Solution. Dr. Silkworth is making it clear that he believes there is a solution. So what does this do to the apparent hopelessness that we carry in here with us? See how important it is for new people to read this, to become familiar with what's being said here, because there is hope for everybody. There is a solution. He goes on to say this: about 1 year prior to this experience, a man was brought in to be treated for chronic alcoholism. He had but partially recovered from a gastric hemorrhage and seemed to be a case of pathological mental deterioration. That's pretty serious. Now we're getting down to the point of feeble-mindedness. He had lost everything worthwhile in life and was only living, one might say, to drink. He frankly admitted and believed that for him there was no hope. Following the elimination of alcohol, there was found to be no permanent brain injury. He accepted the plan outlined in this book. 1 year later, he called in to see me, and I experienced a very strange sensation. I knew the man by name and partly recognized his features, but there all resemblance ended. From a trembling, despairing, nervous wreck had emerged a man brimming over with self-reliance and contentment. I had talked with him for some time, but was not able to bring myself to feel that I had known him before. To me, he was a stranger, and so he left me. A long time has passed with no return to alcohol. Remember what the promise is, guys, back there in the promises? That our whole attitude and outlook upon life will change. Remember when we get to the third step, what it tells us? We were reborn. There's a total rebirth of thinking. Remember what it tells us, that when the spiritual malady is overcome, we will straighten out mentally and physically. You can watch the transformation of newcomers within weeks. Not months, but within weeks. The whole thing, their face changes, their expression changes, their carriage changes. Everything about them begins to change. There's a smile on their face, there's a lilt in their voice, there's optimism. Where before there had been a nervous, despairing, trembling wreck. And a lot of us in here have experienced that. We know what the doctor's talking about. Going on, he says, when I need a mental uplift, I often think of another case brought in by a physician prominent in New York. The patient had made his own diagnosis and deciding his situation hopeless, had hidden in a deserted barn, determined to die. He was rescued by a searching party and in desperate condition brought to me. Following his physical rehabilitation, he had a talk with me in which he frankly stated he thought the treatment a waste of effort, unless I could assure him, which no one ever had, that in the future he would have the willpower to resist the impulse to drink. Well, I guess all of us have found out how illusory this idea of willpower really is. And yet so many people are insistent that we should exercise our willpower. And if we only had a little more willpower, a little bit more motivation, we would be able to stop drinking or modify our drinking. And yet we have to find out, and we have to accept the fact that there is no such thing as stopping drinking on willpower alone. His alcoholic problem was so complex and his depression so great that we felt his only hope would be through what we then called moral psychology, and we doubted if even that would have any effect. Now, moral psychology, you notice the use of the word moral there, because Dr. Silkworth was really not much into religion or religious ideas, but he was certainly a student of morals and ethics, and he believed in that. And he was right in the same class with some other psychologists and psychiatrists who were beginning to understand that in order for them to be effective with their clients and their patients, they were going to have to take into account the spiritual side of the patient's lives as well as the medical and mental side. Top of the page, next page. However, he did become sold on the idea contained in this book. He has not had a drink for a great many years. I see him now and then, and he is as fine a specimen of manhood as one could wish to meet. Now then, this last little sentence is so important, because we have to remember where it's coming from and the circumstances under which it comes. Let's see what Dr. Silkworth says. I earnestly advise every alcoholic to read this book through. And though perhaps he came to scoff, he may remain to pray. The last word in the doctor's opinion is pray. I earnestly advise every alcoholic to read this book through. Now, that's exactly what we learned in the 7th chapter. Please turn now to page 95. Page 95 is discussing how we work with a new person. We've taken him through as much as we can up to this point. We've told him about ourselves and how we drank. We told him about the disease. We told him how we recovered. On page 95, the 3rd paragraph. If he is sincerely interested and wants to see you again, ask him to read this book in the interval. After doing that, he must decide for himself whether he wants to go on. Please notice that the word "this book," it does not say some parts of this book or a Leader's Digest expurgated version of this book or an as your sponsor sees it part of this book, but the book. Read this book in the interval. And there's a very good reason for that. We'll discuss that in a minute. After doing that, he must decide for himself whether he wants to go on. He should not be pushed or prodded by you, his wife, or his friends. If he is to find God, the desire must come from within. And we forget that a lot, guys. Somehow or another, we think that we are so articulate and we are so convincing that we can take the new person and somehow or another talk them into the idea of working the steps and getting sober. The Big Book tells us just the opposite. If he is to find God, the desire must come from within. We cannot force any of this to happen. Page 1, 1917, and war fever ran high in the New England town to which we knew young officers from Plattsburgh were assigned. And we were flattered when the first citizens took us to their homes, making us feel heroic. That wouldn't happen these days, would it? No. Keep those warmongers out of my house. Bunch of cowboys. Just like our president, right? That's what they're saying about him now. Here was love, applause, war, moments sublime with intervals hilarious. See how romanticizing this war thing Bill was making it? And this was what was going on in his head. He was loving this stuff. He was in uniform, he was an officer, they were treating him like a hero. Wow, this was great stuff. Lots of fun, lots of laughs. I was part of life at last. And in the midst of the excitement, I discovered liquor. Now, in other writings, Bill has described this discovery as being this. He said it was the release from pain. And later, of course, you and I have come to understand from our own experience that fear is extraordinarily painful. And Bill felt the release from this pain. And they do say, and I think it's probably true, that the most exquisite feeling in the world is the release from pain. Most of the people in here, I'm sure you guys can remember, at least faintly, if not strongly, how it felt that first time when you had that first drink or two, and suddenly there's such a change with the fear gone. And instead of being a weak, sniveling, ugly, homely coward who was being talked about by everybody behind our backs, rightfully so, because we had nothing, or if we pretended we had something down deep inside, we didn't believe it. Afraid of our shadows, afraid to do what we wanted to do for fear we might be rejected or laughed at. And all of a sudden, bulletproof, wow, immortal, 10 feet tall, irresistible, funny, absolutely charming, handsome, beautiful. It was all there because the pain of fear was gone. And so we loved it. And you know, if my own experience is any indication, it never was quite that good again. Even though it was a vain effort from then on to recapture those moments of the past. I've heard the same thing said by people who have become addicted to drugs, that the first drug experience can never really be repeated, although we keep looking for it and looking for it. I forgot the strong warnings and prejudices of my people concerning drink. In time, we sailed for over there. I was very lonely, and again I turned to liquor, to alcohol. We landed in England. I visited Winchester Cathedral. Much moved, I wandered outside. My attention was caught by a doggerel on an old tombstone. Now Bill steps over something right here, and I'm not quite sure why he did it. But while Bill was in that cathedral, in other writings he tells us about this, that there was something that happened to him while he was in that cathedral, that there was like this great wind blowing through, and he felt tremendously close to God at that time. It was quite a powerful experience for him. And when he tells us a little bit later about what happened to him when he had that epiphany, you know, that very powerful spiritual experience later, he relates that as if he was again experiencing what he had experienced in the Winchester Cathedral. So I moved outside, I wandered outside, my attention was caught by a doggerel on an old tombstone. Now, doggerel is a word which is used to describe poetry or some kind of poetic thing which is really is pretty trite, not poetry in the sense of a great poet, but more like roses are red, violets are blue, and this kind of stuff. That would be a doggerel verse. And this is on an old tombstone. Now here we need to kind of consider what we're going to be reading, because if you were to go to Winchester Cathedral today, you would find this tombstone. It has been replaced twice. The Hampshire Grenadiers are a regiment which is still in existence, and they have maintained this tombstone. And if you were to go there on a warm spring day at lunchtime, you would find the people, the secretaries and so forth from the businesses across the street over there in that graveyard sitting around having their lunch, some of them laying up against this tombstone. Now, you may not believe this, but I do. I think this is the most famous tombstone in the whole world, because the same verse in 28 languages and something like 70 million volumes of this book is scattered all over the world. Everybody who's ever read this book has read this tombstone. Now there's a little bit more on it, and there are pictures of this thing, by the way, that are floating around. And I had a nice big one, but it got lost when the feds took my car, so I haven't been able to find another one yet. I do have a little postcard, however, that my friend Sammy Smith sent me. Sammy's a short timer. He's 5 months less sober than me, so I keep telling him, you know, you kids, you gotta learn to do more work. But Sammy's a retired lawyer, and he really retired, and he floats around the world. So he sends me a postcard now and then. He sent me a postcard. Believe it or not, somebody's gone to trouble making up postcards of this tombstone, and you can buy them there well, I don't know, I guess in Winchester and maybe other places. Let's see what it says now. We have to kind of remember this was written back in the 1700s. Here lies a Hampshire Grenadier. The Grenadier was a foot soldier. Literally threw grenades. That's what they called them. They were just kind of hand bombs. Here lies a Hampshire Grenadier. Hampshire is the regiment, who caught his death drinking cold, small beer. Now, the beer was cold, and it was a small beer, which in England at that time was something other than stout or ale or one of the more potent drinks. A small beer didn't mean the size of the glass or anything, or the mug. It's talking about the potency and the color. It was a lighter beer. So he caught his death drinking cold, small beer. Now, what I imagine this, because I saw this happen in Las Vegas one time, and this is probably clear off base, but I was on Las Vegas Boulevard on the Strip, and it was about 115 degrees in the middle of the summer. It was so hot on the pavement, if you didn't have thick soles on, you'd burn your feet. And this guy came stumbling out of a bar, and apparently he'd been sitting there drinking cold beer, and he hit that wall of that heat, and he died. Boom, it nailed him just like that. So I'm thinking maybe that's what happened to this guy. A good soldier is never forgot, whether he dieth by musket or by pot. And I know what all of you are thinking. This is not wacky tobacco. The word pot here refers to the receptacle for the beer. if you went into a pub in those days, you would order a pot. And today, if you went in and ordered a pot, the bobbies would arrest you. But in those days, you ordered a pot and it was filled with beer or ale or whatever you were getting. Ominous warning, which I failed to heed. Bill is saying, look at this. He died by drinking a cold small beer. Ominous warning, which I failed to heed. 22 and a veteran of foreign wars, I went home at last. I fancied myself a leader, or had not the men of my battery given me a special token of appreciation? My talent for leadership, I imagined, would place me at the head of vast enterprises, which I would manage with the utmost assurance. I know there's nobody in here who didn't have those thoughts at 22. Grandiosity, that's one of the hallmarks of us, you know. And most of us have got a pretty good reason to be grandiose, you know. We're pretty smart people. We've got a whole hell of a lot in the ball. It's amazing how many people who come in here would, if they chose to apply, would be embraced immediately by Mensa. And people in AA, so many of them have been extremely successful in their life, not necessarily monetarily, but in their achievements. I don't know whether that means anything or not, but I've certainly have seen it. And I'm not talking about that we come from the upper echelons of society, by no means. That doesn't seem to have anything to do with it. But here is our friend Bill, who having come back from the war, was ready to conquer the world. Let's go on page 2 now. I took a night law course and obtained employment as investigator for a surety company. Well, Bill just followed the same thing. I see what I did. I was over there in Korea getting shot at, and I thought I was some kind of a big shot. And then they brought me back over here, and Marine Corps in their wisdom made me a drill instructor. And a drill instructor gets to be God. I mean, nobody questions anything you're doing. And once in a while, the captain of your company may come around and ask you what you're doing, but basically you're on your own, and you got a whole bunch of people, and you have almost life and death control of them. At least they did then. And so, when I mustered out of that thing, I went right to law school, because I figured the last thing in the world I want to be was some kind of a school teacher, or I sure didn't want to be going around 2, 3, whoop, the rest of my life. So I got right into law school. You know, I looked around, I thought, these lawyers are running the government, lawyers are running the corporations. Nobody had ever said to me, what is the difference between a lawyer and a catfish? Does anybody know? Oh, you should know that. One is a bottom-dwelling mudsucker, and the other is a fish. I got to tell you another one. See, here's what happened. The Pope died, and he went up to heaven, and he was standing there before St. Pete, and there was this guy standing next to him who was a lawyer. And so St. Pete opened up his book, and he turned to the lawyer, and he said, boy, we're sure glad you're here. This is wonderful. He said, now, just over this hill, you will find your mansion, and you'll find beautiful, extensive grounds, and you have a couple of wonderful servants, and your limousine will be here in just a moment to pick you up and take you to your mansion. And this lawyer was very grateful, and he thanked St. Peter. And the Pope was standing there with his bare face hanging out, and he's looking very expectant, because after all, he is the Pope. And Pete looked up and he said, are you still here? He said, don't you have something for me? He said, oh yeah, let's see, you're Pius the 96, right? Yes, that's right, I'm the Pope. He said, oh, let me see what I got. Oh, he said, right over here, if you go down over that little hill, you'll find a shack, a kind of a hovel, and it's got a couple of goats out in front, and there's a little vegetable garden, and that's your place. You better get going. I can't believe this. The Pope was dumbstruck. He said, "You gave that lawyer a mansion with servants and extensive grounds and a limousine, and me, the Pope, you gave me that hovel with goats? What's going on here?" St. Pete looked at him and he said, "You know what? We've had a whole bunch of popes through here, but that's the first lawyer we ever had." Okay, let's get back to the work here. Oh my. Anyway, I became a lawyer just like Bill. Well, he did. He kind of pooped out toward the end because he saw that lawyers weren't making any money, but the guys in the stock market were. He says the drive for success was on. We're top of page 2 now. I proved to the world I was important. My work took me about Wall Street, and little by little I became interested in the market. Many people lost money, but some became very rich. Why not I? I studied economics and business as well as law. Potential alcoholic that I was, I nearly failed my law course. At one of the finals, I was too drunk to think or write. Though my drinking was not yet continuous, it disturbed my wife. We had long talks when I would still her forebodings by telling her that when men of genius conceived their best projects, they were drunk. That the most majestic constructions of philosophic thought were so derived. Well, look at Papa down there in Key West. Look at the beautiful stuff he's writing. By the time I'd completed the course, I knew the law was not for me. The inviting maelstrom of Wall Street had me in its grip. Business and financial leaders were my heroes. Out of this alloy of drink and speculation, I commenced to forge the weapon that one day would turn in its flight like a boomerang and all but cut me to ribbons. Living modestly, my wife and I saved $1,000. It went into certain securities, then cheap and rather unpopular. I rightly imagined they would someday have a great rise. I failed to persuade my broker friends to send me out looking over factories and managements, but my wife and I decided to go anyway. I developed a theory that most people lost money in stocks through ignorance of markets. I discovered many more reasons later on. Now here's what happened. We're going to read about it here in a second. Can you imagine this now? See, what happened here was that Bill, he was pretty smart, and he was right too, by the way, that these guys on Wall Street and the people they were advising were really dealing in the dark. They had no idea what was going on in these companies, especially the smaller ones. So, but if they had first-hand knowledge, they could make some informed decisions about investing in one company and not in another. And that somebody ought to be out there doing this and looking it over and finding out what's going on. And so Bill finally decided that it had to be him, and that if he did that, he would make his name on Wall Street. Let's see what happened. Bottom of page 2. We gave up our positions and off we roared on a motorcycle. The sidecar stuffed with tent, blankets, a change of clothes, 3 huge volumes of financial reference service. He isn't saying it, but of course, and also Lois. You can imagine what that looked like. Our friends thought a lunacy commission should be appointed. And we don't have those anymore. But lunacy commission, that was a real thing. It was kind of a star chamber where somebody would rat you out if you were crazy. And then the cops would see to it that you were hauled before a lunacy commission. And the purpose there was to find out whether you were crazy or not, and if you were, to incarcerate you somewhere in Bedlam where you'd never surface again. And it was a great way to get rid of your wife. We don't have those anymore, but there was something like that, you know. We're going to read about it later. When Bill's friend Debbie was hauled up before a judge, he was hauled up for being an incorrigible drunk, and they were going to stick him away. But fortunately for you and me, that didn't happen. We'll see about that a little later. Okay, our friend saw a lunacy commission should be appointed. Perhaps they were right. I had some success at speculation, so we had a little money, but we once worked on a farm for a month to avoid drawing on our small capital. That was the last honest manual labor on my part for many a day. We covered the whole eastern United States in a year. Now let's see what Bill was doing. He writes about this in other places. It's kind of funny, I think. It's kind of interesting. He'd go see, like be up in New England, right? In those days they had all these mill towns, and many of them, these were not pills you take. These were towns with a mill in them. Anyway, these mill towns, and some of them were still, they still had the big water wheels and stuff. And he wouldn't go into the factory and talk to the management to see what was going on. He'd go down to the local bar, and he'd get 3 or 4 of the workmen in there from the place, buy them some drinks, get them talking. He got all the lowdown on these places right out of those bars. And then he would write up a report. Oh, he'd go around, he'd make some cursory inspections of premises, but his basic information was coming from the people whose mouths got loosened by a little bit of Jack or whatever else they were drinking. At the end of this journey, at the end of it, my reports to Wall Street procured me a position there and the use of a large expense account. What he's not saying, and in other writings he tells us about, he was sending these reports in like weekly, and some of the guys, the bright guys on Wall Street, began to see that this was a straight poop. This was present information. This was current, and it was like today, everything is so, nobody's hidden anymore because everything is wide open through the internet and the phone, and everybody knows everybody's business now. But in those days it was pretty hard to get information, and here was Bill with first-hand stuff, and these guys on the street were cashing in on it big time. So as soon as he got back, they immediately brought him into the company, gave him a big expense account. Boy, he loved that. The exercise of an option brought in more money, leaving us with a profit of several $1,000s for that year. Now, options have become a dirty word in the last 3 months, haven't they? That's what they're nailing all these guys, these top executives who are being indicted and tried, and because of the misuse of options. Anyway, Bill made a lot of money that year, and boy, that was the beginning for him. For the next few years, he says, fortune threw money and applause my way. And you got to remember, we're talking about the 20s, and this is before the big crash of 1929. And the stock market was a big, blooming bull market. And Bill was right in the middle of this, and he was making a fortune. He had lots and lots of money at that time. I had arrived, he said. Oh boy. His motto was, whether you're rich or poor, it's nice to have money. Or even the motto that I believe in, I've been rich and I've been poor and I like rich better, That's for damn sure. Oh boy. Anyway, maybe someday. I got a deal I'm doing right now that see, you never quit. I mean, this ain't going to make me $1 million, I promise you. And no, you can't borrow any of it either. I'm keeping it all for myself. Okay. My judgment and ideas were followed by many to the tune of paper millions. And I swear to you that this was more important to Bill than the money he was making. That he was being accorded all of this notoriety, all of this love and attention, and people considering him to be a financial wizard was much more important to him than the money. I keep telling people, others will work much harder for their name and lights than they ever will for money. Give them recognition. Well, they're just doing what they're supposed to do. Good. Well, your company's going on its butt, friend. The company that recognizes the need of human beings to be recognized for their as being worthwhile, being given pats on the back and plaudits and awards and all that, that's a company that survives. The great boom of the late 20s was seething and swelling. drink was taking an important and exhilarating part of my life. There was loud talk in the jazz places uptown. You got to remember now, this is Prohibition. And so these jazz places, of course, were all, what did they call them in those days? Speakeasy. Yeah, they were all well, you know, all you had to do to keep a speakeasy open is pay off the cops. And, you know, and buy your liquor from the mob, and then everything was fine. Nobody bothered you. I watched the Ness series, you know. What do they call that? Huh?
Elliot Ness.
Elliot Ness, yeah. What was it called?
Untouchables.
Oh, the Untouchables, yeah. I got all my first-hand knowledge from that. I guess there's probably as much mythology about that time as we hear about some of the stuff 20, 30 centuries ago. It's still mythology. Everyone spending thousands and chattered in millions. Scoffers could scoff and be damned. I made a host of fair weather friends. Now, you guys have never had any of those, have you? I remember after I got sober, I used to go back to the Dolce Vita and say, gee, I'm sure glad to see all you guys. Hell, they didn't even know me then. I thought they would miss me. I thought that they probably hadn't let anybody else sit on my stool. And I found somebody that was right there, drinking my scotch. Did you guys miss me? Who are you? Fair weather friends. Okay, my drinking assumed more serious proportions, continuing all day and almost every night. The remonstrances of my friends terminated in a row, and I became a lone wolf. There were many unhappy scenes in our sumptuous apartment. There had been no real infidelity. I love that word, real, don't you? What in the hell is no real infidelity? Oh man, that's about as weak-kneed as honest desire. No real infidelity. I guess maybe my mind just runs in those channels. Anyway, for loyalty to my wife, helped at times by extreme drunkenness, kept me out of those scrapes. He's admitting here he was too drunk to get it up. And that's what he meant by no real. I remember when I was in Atlanta, and I had a business there, and I was building houses, and I had my Porsche, my limousine, my little blonde girlfriend, and there's a place in Atlanta called the NABA Club, North Atlanta Benevolent Association. It's an AA club, and it's pretty fancy, you know, on that, Linda. It's a freestanding building with a basement with a great big cafeteria in it. And they serve 3 meals a day in their cafeterias, and beautiful meals. They got the big TV, giant TV room with theater seats and all this stuff. And it's really high. In fact, it's got a lock on the door, and you got to have one of these keys, you know, that just, one of these cards that goes like going into the Pentagon or something. And so I was going to some meetings there, but my friends and I would sit around in that cafeteria, and we'd tell lies and brag about what great AAs we were. But I got to a point where I wasn't going to go to a meeting until somebody asked me to speak, and I got sick as a dog. Man, I was walking around with untreated alcoholism. And so God came along and he said, you know, Jim, he's thinking this to himself, I'm sure. Excuse me if I do this, but I'm pretty sure this is what he was saying. I gave you all this grace, I've been with you all this time. And now you're sitting there like a dummy pretending that all you got to do is go to a meeting now and then, and you don't have to work with anybody. You can sit around and tell lies and brag about how great an AA you are. I'm going to fix your wagon. So my business went bankrupt. My girlfriend left me. She was never going to leave me. She loved me forever. She found out that I was going broke. It took her exactly 2 hours to clear out. And the next day I saw her driving down the street with this judge friend of ours in his Cadillac, damn near sitting in his lap. I wanted to kill that sucker. Whatever was left of my tail between my legs, I exited Atlanta and ended up in Las Vegas broke. And I had sold my Porsche, my limousine, let my driver go, sold the house. I sold everything just to try to stay out of bankruptcy. And I finally was able to do that. But I left town carrying and wearing my wardrobe. And when I got to Vegas, I ended up in a three-quarter-way house, 17 years sober, sleeping in their parking lot with an old yaller dog and on a hot July night, which happened to be the eve of my belly button birthday, and feeling rotten and sorry for myself. And 2 days later I found myself out in the industrial district on the telephone selling ballpoint pens with your name on them to every shade tree mechanic I could find in. And I was looking for born again mooches. And you know what they got for 100 pens? They got a diamond necklace for their wife. I swear to God they did. It was an uncut diamond, of course. Looked like a freeze-dried piece of pigeon shit, actually, but it was a real diamond. There exists among us this fellowship and a friendliness and understanding which is indescribably wonderful. We are like the passengers of a great liner the moment after rescue from shipwreck, when camaraderie, joyousness, and democracy pervade the vessel from steerage to captain's table. Unlike the feelings of the ship's passengers, however, our joy in escape from disaster does not subside as we go our individual ways. The feeling of having shared in a common peril is one element in the powerful cement which binds us. But that in itself would never have held us together as we are now joined. And here comes the tremendous fact. This is AA trivia. If you're looking for the tremendous fact for every one of us, is that we have discovered a common solution. Now that's very instructive, isn't it? You see, today, New Age AAers are running around telling us, oh, well, there's no such thing as any kind of a program here, really. And remember that more will be revealed to you. And we get to learn from our friends, the psychiatrists and the psychologists and everybody else out there who's got a master's degree in something or other. And so we get to make up all our own stuff. We don't have to pay any attention to what the Big Book says anymore, because there is no common solution. That's what they're telling us. The Big Book says just the opposite. That we have discovered a common solution. And what did they do, guys? They wrote it down. That's what this book is. This book is a revelation to us of the common solution which these people found. And they wrote it down, and they said to show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this volume. And that's why they wrote it, so that they could show us what they did. And they're saying to us, we truly believe that if you do what we did, you too will recover. Over and over again it tells us, follow directions, pick up the simple kit of spiritual tools. Over and over we hear the same thing. And yet we keep hearing this stuff that would lead us down the garden paths and have us make up all our own things about how it works. It'll work better this way because some psychologist says so. If you were to pick up some of the 12-step programs that are out there, like some of the churches have 12-step programs. And the church stuff is great. The scriptural stuff is terrific. But look at the steps. They have the biggest idea how these steps are supposed to work. They're all scrunched and screwed around to sort of kind of like fit in with some sort of a preconceived idea about how they ought to fit. And they don't work. They do not work. So we have a way out on which we can absolutely agree. And that's what this book is, their agreement. And upon which we can join in brotherly and harmonious action. This is the great news this book carries for those who suffer from alcoholism. What is the great news? That these people have found a common solution. That they absolutely agree upon it. And that it works. And that here in this book they have revealed this to us. They have said it out. Okay, now then, we're going back. This is going to reprise for us the doctor's opinion. An illness of this sort, and we've come to believe it an illness, involves those about us in a way no other human sickness can. If a person has cancer, all are sorry for him, and no one is angry or hurt. But not so with the alcoholic illness. For with it there goes annihilation of all things worthwhile in life. It engulfs all whose lives touch the sufferers. It brings misunderstanding, fierce resentment, financial insecurity, disgusted friends and employers, warped lives of blameless children, sad wives and parents. Anyone can increase the list. Now this is a very, very important paragraph for somebody who's new. Somewhere in that list they're going to find themselves, aren't they? If they're even being the least bit honest about themselves by this time. And you know what? This is sad to say, but today, when somebody comes up to me who's drunk and slobbering around, I feel sorry for them. I know they're sick. Sometimes I just wish they'd go away. Because they're disgusting. Now I'll admit this to you. Now I know what I'm supposed to do, and 99% of the time I'll do it. But there's a lot of times when I don't want to. And I've been doing this for 38 years. And I'm still not used to it. So you can imagine what's going on out there with people who have no idea what's wrong with us. I mean, the kind of responses and reactions and the disgust that we generate in others, it's no wonder that we're pariahs. It's no wonder that they, in the old days, they hid us away. They locked us up. They put us in insane asylums, or the family would build a bedroom in the attic and lock the door, whatever it took, get grandpa away from the kids, you know, the disgusting old man, because we didn't know. And so when we read this, we can clearly understand the kind of impact that our disease and the way we have functioned with our disease has had upon those who've been around us. Somebody once said, I don't know if it's true or not, but somebody once said that the average alcoholic, you and me, has seriously affected the lives of at least 7 other people. Just think of that. Increasing the impact of this disease 8-fold. And I don't think that that's very far from the truth. It's a scourge. It's an absolute scourge. And you know, it's been around here. We've been around with human beings practically forever. I think we talked about this before. They found the Peking man in the caves outside of Peking, now Tianjin, or whatever they call it now, China. That they'd been fermenting berries 225,000 years ago, and you just know there were a bunch of drunks in those caves. And we haven't come any further than that, except that God in in his wisdom and in his mercy 67 years ago, decided to step in and give us a solution that we never had before. There was no solution. And when we walk in these doors and we're feeling sorry for ourselves, if we only knew just how blessed we are to be here, if we only knew what a miracle was being worked in our lives to give us this opportunity for a whole new life, that when I was born in 1928, there was no such thing. Going on, we hope this volume will inform and comfort those who are or who may be affected. There are many. Highly competent psychiatrists who have dealt with us have found it sometimes impossible to persuade an alcoholic to discuss his situation without reserve. Oh boy, however true that is. Strangely enough, wives, parents, intimate friends usually find us even more unapproachable than do the psychiatrist and the doctor. You know, a lot of times people talk to me about the fact that in their families they've got somebody who's seriously affected. And what can I do? And I have to refer them to the chapter of wives. Because what this is saying is true. When we have a very close personal or familial relationship with somebody, it's nearly impossible to do anything to help them. Because they're not listening to us. We're carrying all this baggage in our relationship with them. And so it's far better left to somebody who is the third party. Now then, this next paragraph is a paragraph which is in italics. And every time we see this, we know that we have something that Bill considered to be of extreme importance. The ex-problem drinker who has found this solution, who is properly armed with facts about himself, can generally win the entire confidence of another alcoholic in a few hours. Until such an understanding is reached, little or nothing can be accomplished. Now, this is a tremendously important paragraph. Let's burn it into our foreheads. Let's go back and remember our history now. Remember that Bill went 6 months after he got out of Towns Hospital trying to find anybody who would follow the path he had taken. And he was unsuccessful. He would go to Towns Hospital and talk to the hopeless, sick, sore, and wounded that Dr. Silkworth had stashed over in the corner. He would go downtown. He would go wherever he could, and he tried desperately to get anybody to listen to him. And finally, he went to Silkworth and he said, "Doctor, I don't know what's going on here. I can't get anybody to listen to me. I bring them over to my house. They try to burn my house down. They eat my food. They steal my money, and then they're gone. They get drunk again. And I haven't been able to get anybody sober." Silkworth probably looked at him and says, "Bill, one thing you're probably not doing right is when you see them, tell them they're a drunk and they got to get down on their knees and start praying right away. That probably isn't going to work too well." "Well, what will work, Doc?" He said, "First, you got to tell them about yourself. How are they going to believe you if they don't know that you know what you're talking about? You got to tell them how you drank. You got to tell them how alcohol affected you. You got to tell them about that frustration, bitterness, the despair. You got to tell them about the angers and the rages, the thoughts of revenge. You got to tell them about the dishonesty and the selfishness and the resentments. You got to tell them how you could not sleep. You got to tell them how you could not stop drinking. You got to tell them these things which will show them that you've been there before them. You tell them about losing your family if you did, or your job if you did, or whatever it is that happened to you. And then, if they're still listening to you, you tell them how you recovered. You tell them what you did. Tell them how you tried to stop and couldn't. Tell them how you recovered. If they're still interested, then what you have to do is you got to tell them what's wrong with them. So they don't know what's the matter with them. You talking to some guy who's sitting here and he knows he's sick, maybe he's got a bad hangover, maybe he's out of money. He doesn't have any idea what's going on here. You got to tell him what's wrong. He said, Bill, I remember now, and this has really been important for me, he said, to remember this. When you and Lois were leaving my hospital for the second time, I said to you and to your wife, I can't help you, because you have a disease over which I have no power. No human being has any power. Your disease is incurable, and it is fatal, and it is progressive. And if you do not stop drinking, you will be dead within a year. He said, I know now that when I told you that, I was helping to prepare you for the time when someone would come to you that you would listen to. It is something that was necessary to open your mind enough that you would be willing to listen to someone that you could believe. And when your friend Eddie came to you, that's exactly what happened. He says, I know now that that's what you have to do. You got to tell them what's wrong with them. Then, if they're still interested, he said, then tell them again how you recovered. And stress the spiritual freely. Talk about higher power. Talk about God. Talk about that massive psychic change. Talk about a spiritual awakening or a spiritual experience. Something to interest them beyond mere froth and frilly stuff that they've been hearing. And when Dr. Silkworth got around to writing his opinion, remember what he said? Frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices. The message which will interest these alcoholic people must have depth and weight. And this is what he was telling Bill. What's the first requirement then? This sick, suffering alcoholic has to believe us. We have to establish our bona fides. We have to establish some kind of a connection with them so that they'll listen to us. Let's see what this says again. Ex-problem drinkers who have found this solution are properly armed with facts about himself can generally win the entire confidence of another alcoholic in a few hours. Until such an understanding is reached, little or nothing can be accomplished. It does not say what we just got through talking about, how to use this knowledge, what to do with it. We have to put it out there. We have to establish our bona fides. We have to be able, when we leave this situation, we want this person to say the same thing that Dr. Bob said about Bill. He was the first man who ever talked to me about this problem who knew what in the world he was talking about. And that's why I listened to him. Well, thank you God, it was only shortly after Dr. Silkworth had this talk with Bill, explaining to him what he was going to have to do if he was going to have any success at all, getting anybody to even listen to him. Bill went to Akron, fell on his sword in his business thing, was down, depressed, thinking about drinking. And through God's grace, he found Dr. Bob through the minister and through Henrietta Sieberling. And when he found Dr. Bob, he remembered what Silkworth had told him, and that's exactly what he did. He told Bob about his own drinking, how he drank and what it did to him, and how he couldn't stop when he wanted to, and how it was going to kill him. And he told Bob about this disease, and Bob didn't have any idea about that. He was a doctor, but he'd never been taught anything like that. And then he told Bob how he'd recovered. And the rest, they say, is history. And so this little paragraph tells us then what we began to intimate when we were back there in Bill's story. Now you will remember that while Bill was still in the hospital, the thought, the inspiration came to him that there must be thousands of alcoholics out there who could profit from what had been so freely given him, and that he needed to go out and share this with them. And when he talked to his friend Ebby about this, Ebby said, yes, Bill, faith without works is dead. And then Bill came to this understanding, which he wrote for us, and it's in his story, that if an alcoholic fails to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he cannot survive the certain low spots ahead, and he'll drink again. That's the basis of Alcoholics Anonymous. You see, without that, there'd be no fellowship, would there? Be a bunch of individuals selfishly out there seeking their own salvation, just as we find in every other walk of life, except in here. And here, if you want to call it salvation, our salvation depends upon our willingness to take what we've been given and give it away to someone else, freely, without any demands for anything whatsoever. And this is what we do. If an alcoholic fails to enlarge and perfect his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he cannot survive the certain low spots ahead. And that's the extension of this paragraph. That we can do that because we have been there before. Let's turn to page 89, please. One of the things we try to do, if you haven't joined us before, is we try to see how all these things in the Big Book kind of tie together so that they give us a continuing panoply of recovery. Right at the top of page 89 now. Practical experience shows that nothing will so much ensure immunity from drinking as intensive work with other alcoholics. It works when other activities fail. This is our 12th suggestion. Now here we go. Carry this message to other alcoholics. You can help when no one else can. You can secure their confidence when others fail. Remember, they are very ill. So you see, this is just an extension, is it not, of this little paragraph back here on page 18. Do you have a question? Just stretching? Okay. Now then, let's go back down on page 18, the partial paragraph at the bottom of the page. That the man who is making the approach has had the same difficulty, that he obviously knows what he's talking about, that his whole deportment shouts at the new prospect that he is a man with a real answer, that he has no attitude of holier than thou, nothing whatever except a sincere desire to be helpful, that there are no fees to pay, no axes to grind, no people to please, no lectures to be endured. These are the conditions we found most effective. After such an approach, many take up their beds and walk again. So you see, that all puts it all in a nutshell, doesn't it? This is why we can help when no one else can. This little paragraph is a paragraph which was kind of a disclaimer. In the beginning, these guys had a lot of debates about what was going to happen here, because you see, they figured that the moment this book was published, it was going to go flying out the door. That they'd have to have a reprint run after about 6 days. The warehouse would be empty. That didn't happen, of course, until later. But they were afraid that they were going to be deluged with drunks looking for help, and that they wouldn't be able to handle it. So Bill wrote, none of us makes a sole vocation of this work, nor do we think its effectiveness would be increased if we did. It's kind of interesting too, isn't it? Stop and think about it. How many people are out there now who do make a sole vocation of working with alcoholics in recovery? Now, not too many of them are members of the fellowship. Many of them have many other disciplines which they follow. These guys recognize right from the beginning that that may not be the way to do it, and for good reason. That good reason turns out to be that as soon as possible, the recovering sufferer must be getting back on their own 2 feet, taking responsibility for their own lives, beginning to repair the damage done. and to sequester them or cloister them for 6 months in Mississippi doesn't seem to work very well. How in the world do you learn not to be dependent on others if you are kept dependent upon them? How in the world do we ever begin to grow up until we begin to take responsibility for ourselves? Our drinking is but a beginning. Anyway, that's the way I read that. You wouldn't think so around these rooms. You didn't drink today, you had a great day. But I was miserable, it was a terrible day. Let me tell you all the bad things. You didn't drink today, you had a good day. What balderdash? This book isn't about not drinking, you know. Never once in here does it say don't drink. It says find God. Go from a place of rebellion and defiance to a place of surrender and obedience. That is what will solve your problems. Tells us we've written a book. And the purpose of this book is to show you and me how they recovered, and how they recovered was they earnestly sought God. And they sought to surrender to God. And when they did so, they got sober and they got clean and they grew spiritually. That's what they're telling us. A much more important demonstration of our principles lies before us in our respective houses, occupations, and affairs. Think about that. Isn't this direct appeal to us to take our third step prayer seriously? God, take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help. Of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life, meaning working in and through me, so that I can be an example to you, so that you can see by my actions that what I'm doing is working. And maybe, just maybe, then you'll want what I have. And we ask God to make us this example. And we ask Him to do this, and the prayer that we ask Him to, when we ask Him to do that, the prayer is answered. With most of us by the time we reach the 12th step. Remember, in the 12th step, we are at that point empowered to carry this message to others. Which means, of course, that we're going to carry the message more with our actions by far than with our words. If you're out there looking for a sponsor, I promise you what you ought to be doing is watching what they do.